Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rabbi Lustig. I'd like to welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation for this morning's program. This week we read in our Torah the first story recorded about the paradigmatic immigrant or refugee, Amram. God calls to go forth, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoledecha mibeit avicha. Leave your native land, the land of your birth, from your father's house. Abraham leaves everything he knows to follow the promise of a better life. The story has been repeated and lived out in every corner of our earth. Sometimes for religious freedom, sometimes for economic freedom, but far too many times in the history of humanity to escape oppression, degradation, or the threat of death. It is why this past weekend was called Refugee Shabbat in thousands of congregations across the globe. Such stories, such events shape the history of the world, and they of course shape the lives of those who live this reality. Forced from her native land, the land of her birth, from her father's house, our guest this morning was simply put a refugee. Secretary Madeleine Albright writes, "I'm a refugee, but a lucky one. My father would surely have been arrested had he not left Czechoslovakia when he did, but no one threatened to put us in shipping containers, and we arrived in our new homeland on an ocean liner, not an overcrowded raft. When people ask me to sum up my life, I always begin with gratitude to my parents and to the American citizens who allowed my family to make a fresh start. So I find it impossible to be coldly analytical on the subject of immigrants and refugees, and I cannot respect politicians who try to win votes by kindling hatred." Secretary Madeleine Albright was shaped by such events of history, and she has gone on to shape history herself. As America's 64th Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001, she traversed the globe as America's first woman to be named Secretary of State. She did so in an age of unprecedented change. The democracy she and her family found and took refuge in America, its principles of democracy and freedom seem to be blossoming around the world. A democratic government in Poland, Hungary became a democratic republic as well. The Berlin Wall had come down. In her own native land, a prisoner of conscience would be released and become the president of a free Czechoslovakia. Nelson Mandela would find his freedom and be elected the president of South Africa, and Europe was unifying, and countries that merited the label of democracy grew from 35 to over 100. Today, Madeleine Albright asked us, as she writes, and I quote, "What has happened to the uplifting vision? Why does it seem to be fading? Why, per Freedom House, does democracy seem to be under assault and in retreat? Why are many in positions of power seeking to undermine public confidence in elections, courts, the media, and the fundamental question of the Earth's future, science? Why have such dangerous splits been allowed between the development between the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural, those with higher education and those without? Why has the United States abdicated its leadership in world affairs?" she asks. And she asks us finally, this far into the 20th century, why are we once again talking about fascism? End quote. Secretary Albright, a Georgetown professor and a world leader, answers these questions in her timely and in many ways prophetic book, Fascism, A Warning. When a dissenting voice of a journalist enters a foreign embassy and disappears to his death, when the cusp of midterm elections as the political rhetoric mimics what Albright recounts of Mussolini and Hitler's rise to power, this very book raises so many important questions about the future of America and the future of our world community. We are honored to have Madeleine Albright share her insights, her warning, and her hope for the future and democracy itself. As our opening speaker for the Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series, it is indeed once again my privilege and my honor to present Secretary Madeleine Albright.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for welcoming me. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this unique speaker series. I also want to thank you all for coming, because there's no better way to spend a beautiful fall morning than by sitting with friends and talking about fascism. So welcome, everybody. For me, this has been an interesting few months. In April, I began my first book tour since I turned 80 years old, and friends started calling it the Antique Roadshow. And it has been a wild experience. In Las Vegas, I arrived in the middle of a convention of the wine and spirits industry. So I sat at a table signing books for people who were drunk, and behind me there was a great banner that read, "Make Whiskey Great Again." In Miami, despite all the publicity about Me Too, an elderly man stood up and said, and I quote, "I've been around for more than 90 years, but I haven't lost my eyesight, and you're a good-looking gal." So for all I know, he might have been around as the ghost of Strom Thurmond. At the other end of the spectrum, there was a man in Brooklyn who heard me speak and told a journalist later that I was a warmongering ghoul. I know this really happened because it was widely reported by social media in Russia. But what I'm noticing most in my travels around the country is that wherever I go, when I open the floor to questions, 100 hands fly up. Overall, I find the national mood to be cranky, and it's no wonder we're on edge. Our political parties are at war with one another and fighting internally at the same time. We have a president who thinks it's smart politics to drive us apart and whose approach to world affairs causes many to cringe while others stick out their chests. Common ground is hard to find. Instead, we are at each other's throats. And this brings me to the topic of my very non-controversial book, Fascism: A Warning. To me, there were many reasons for writing this book, some broad and one that is very personal. Because for my family, and I suspect for many of yours, fascism isn't just another political philosophy. It's a terrifying and relentless disruptor of human lives. As an infant in Czechoslovakia, shortly before the start of World War II, I was forced by the Nazis to flee with my parents to London, where we survived the Blitz. After the war, communists who emulated fascist techniques once again drove my family from its home. And as the rabbi said, we found refuge in the most generous nation on earth, the United States, where I was given the priceless opportunity to grow up in freedom. Later, as UN Ambassador and Secretary of State, I had confrontations with the perpetrators of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and was the most senior U.S. official until then to negotiate with the fascist ruler of North Korea. In more recent years, as chairman of the National Democratic Institute, I've been involved in the struggle between democracy and dictatorship every day. And I will never forget learning for the first time when I was almost 60 that my heritage was Jewish and that 3 of my grandparents and numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins had been murdered in the Holocaust. So this book comes from personal experience, but it's an experience shared in many ways by millions of others. Because we're all affected, directly or indirectly, by political repression and by human cruelty that rides alongside it. We are all aware, or should be, of the difference to each of us between a world governed by mutual respect and one dominated by the ruthless ambitions of a few. And we should all know that when liberty is threatened, the sound of silence is not just the absence of noise, it's the essence of cowardice and betrayal. In recent years, we've become familiar with the slogan, "If you see something, say something." Well, when I look around the world today, much is happening that disturbs me deeply, so I've added a third element to the slogan: see something, say something, but also do something. Given my history, I'm often asked whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I reply that I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I'm an optimist because I have faith in the resilience of democracy and in the desire of most people to get along with one another in civility and peace. I'm worried because as I speak almost everywhere across the globe, democratic institutions and values are the targets of an attack, the likes of which have not been seen since the breakup of the Soviet Empire. It seems as if almost every week there's a new sham election extending the term of an autocrat as president or prime minister. It has happened already this year in Russia, Egypt, Hungary, Cambodia, and Venezuela. The balloting in Brazil next Sunday will likely produce a government that takes a massive shift to the right. In Asia, the president of the Philippines suggested not long ago that female rebels should be sexually assaulted or shot in the vagina. Earlier, when he was mayor, he joked about a female missionary who had been gang raped, then murdered, saying, "I should have been first in line." Meanwhile, in Europe, extreme nationalist movements are storming the barricades of power, gaining prominent roles within the parliaments of Italy, Austria, the Nordic countries, and most chillingly, Germany. And I want to emphasize that in this context, there's an enormous difference between extreme nationalism, which is often destructive, and patriotism, which I believe is a virtue. Because there's nothing wrong with being proud of one's country, of identifying with its history, culture, language, and cuisine. As a native Czech, I happen to love our national dish, which consists primarily of boiled cabbage and grease. As a little girl, I lived for some time in Belgrade, where my father was the Czech ambassador. What I did was the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport. That was my job. I have kept my national dress. I kept it until a few years ago when I gave it to a museum in Iowa, the Czech and Slovak Museum there. My guess is that each of you share something very basic with me. We were brought up to believe that a true patriot is someone who wants to help his or her country become respected and admired, to be a leader among nations and the champion of values to which people everywhere can subscribe. The kind of country, for example, that is known across the globe as being indivisible and for its dedication to liberty and justice for all. But there's another kind of nationalism, the kind that equates an affinity for us with a hatred for them, the kind that talks about my country, right or wrong, the kind that pays no heed to the well-being of others, the kind that retreats from global responsibility and confuses its own claims of greatness with greatness itself. So here's another reason why I'm worried. For almost as long as I've been alive, the world had been able to count on the United States to serve as the rock against which these forces run aground and break apart. It pains me that I'm not sure we can still make that claim, because for the first time in my memory, we have a president who openly scorns the building blocks of democracy. As I say in my book, and I quote myself, from the early stages of his campaign right into the Oval Office, Donald Trump has spoken harshly about the institutions that make up the foundation of open government. He has systematically degraded political discourse, shown an astonished disregard for facts, libeled his predecessors, threatened to lock up political rivals, referred to mainstream journalists as the enemies of the American people, touted mindlessly nationalist economic policies, vilified immigrants, and nurtured bigotry towards Muslims. To autocrats overseas, these outbursts are catnip. Instead of challenging anti-democratic forces, Trump is a comfort to them, a provider of excuses. In my travels abroad, I hear the same questions all the time. If the American president says the press always lies, how can Vladimir Putin be faulted for making the same claim? If Trump insists that judges are biased and calls the American criminal system a laughingstock, what is to stop a repressive leader in Hungary or Poland from discrediting his own judiciary? And if the leader of the world's most powerful country views life as a dog-eat-dog struggle in which no one gains except at another's cost, who will carry the banner for the international cooperation at a time when the most intractable problems cannot be solved any other way? Unquote. This morning, I'd like to add one more question to the list. If the American president thinks he can make one false statement after another without being held accountable, who will tell the leaders of Saudi Arabia that they can't lie about the disappearance and probable murder of a journalist in their own consulate? And if the answer to that inquiry is no one, just where is our world headed? Another issue I address in my book is what went wrong? Why, almost 75 years after the deaths of Mussolini and Hitler, are we once again talking about fascism? There are a variety of answers, but I think the explanation begins with technology. The same forces that have brought the world closer together have made many people want to cling even more tightly to their ethnic, cultural, and religious identities. Technology has also caused a lot of good jobs to disappear and made it harder for people without specialized skills to earn a living wage. And when men and women feel insecure about the future, they tend to look for someone to blame, someone who isn't like them, outsiders, the strangers, the different. Meanwhile, the rise of social media has enabled us to share our grievances instantly and globally. This has made governing more difficult and given demagogues the chance to build emotional bonfires out of the kindling of lies, prejudice, and paranoia. So bigoted speech is heard more often, and there's a surge in hate crimes, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, sometimes open, sometimes disguised. But let us not be fooled by what is happening. We don't have to belong to the Anti-Defamation League to know that when autocrats in Europe start to smear George Soros and to accuse him of bankrolling diabolical conspiracies, they're not just pointing a finger at one man. They're ripping the scab off a wound that killed 6 million people and has never fully healed. They should be ashamed, and we can't let them get away with it. Now, it's true that one of the principal causes of the current unrest is the record number of what I call, quote, the international homeless, migrants and refugees. The issue of immigration is complicated because countries have a right to protect their borders. The best solution by far is to prevent wars and to create a healthy global economy so people don't have to leave their homes in quest of safety and the means to survive. Now, there are no easy answers, but of one thing I am sure. The situation is not helped when politicians try to advance their careers by suggesting that most migrants are terrorists and rapists, or that families fleeing persecution and war are less than human. Given all the turbulence this issue is causing in Europe and elsewhere, one yearns to see the United States play a positive role. Instead, in America today, we have a policy towards refugees that would make a certain statue in New York Harbor weep. The same statue that I gazed at for the first time when, age 11, I arrived in this country. In fact, we now have a policy towards refugees that is disgraceful, even when compared to the treatment of strangers in ancient Babylon more than 2,500 years ago. I don't have to tell this audience what it means to an individual, to a family, to a racial, ethnic, or religious group to be told by the highest authorities that for you, there is no room. For you, there is no entitlement to dignity. For you, there is only a life of permanent danger, wandering, and exile. My friends, we are better than that. A couple of weeks ago, I did take part in an event with Rabbi David Saperstein, who, as many of you know, is the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Also joining us was David Brooks, a columnist for the New York Times. We called the show Madeleine and the Two Davids. The three of us didn't see eye to eye on everything, but I think that I can say safely that we did agree on a few things. First, whether we are talking about foreign governments or ones closer to home, the best leaders will strive to bring citizens together, not separate them into opposing boxes based on who they are or where they come from or how they worship or the color of their skins. The best leaders will encourage respect for democratic institutions, including an independent judiciary and the doctrine that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The best leaders will understand that a free and independent press is not the enemy of democracy. It is the invention of democracy and the key to its survival. The best leaders will hold others and themselves accountable to the highest standards of truth, whether based on science, law, or the evidence of our own senses. This is vital because fascism thrives when the perception grows that truth is an illusion and that the only reality that matters is power. That was Hitler's truth, and it is an abomination. Finally, the best leaders will have a gift for listening, and not just to hear themselves talk. They will be open to the arguments of others and to the possibility that they might be wrong. And this is a rule that must apply to leaders from all parts of the political spectrum and to average citizens as well. Here, I do my best to practice what I preach, and a lot of people are surprised to learn that when driving to work most mornings, I tune into right-wing talk radio, so you might be careful as I drive around, because there are a lot of hand gestures and yelling. For me, it's a form of adult education, even though the risk to pedestrians is dire. If I should bump into you, don't take it personally. Just let me park and we'll have coffee. One of my favorite quotations is from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Quote, "When I was young, I admired clever people. Now that I'm old, I admire kind people." If we look back through history, we will find many fascists who were clever, at least for a time. We will not find many who, we will not find many who were kind. They were clever. This says something pretty basic, because if we push aside all the huffing and puffing associated with partisan politics and all the complexities involved in formulating public policy, we are left with the simple challenge of treating every person with dignity and respect. Meeting that standard is the single most decisive answer to racism, sexism, and bigotry of all kinds. Here, in this house of prayer, I'd like to close with a story that may be familiar to some of you. It's about a man who does nothing but complain about all that's wrong in the world: the cruelty, pain, repression, disease, poverty, and suffering. Day after day, the man whines to God and bitterly accuses him of seeing all this agony and not lifting a divine finger to prevent it. Finally, a voice is heard thundering down from above, a voice that sounds curiously like that of Archie Bunker. "Stifle yourself," it booms. "I too am grieved by the hardships endured by mortals, but you are wrong to say that I have done nothing to make possible a better world. In fact, I have done everything necessary. I created you." So thank you once again, and now I look forward to responding to your questions, and since I'm no longer in the government, I will be able to answer them.
We want to thank Secretary Albright for all that she has brought forth to us in this great talk, and you'll find brings forth in such power in her book. Before we begin our question and answer series and open it up then for a little bit of discussion, I'd like to call upon our chair of our Amram Scholar Series, Leslie Maitland, to tell you a little bit about what's coming up following Secretary Albright for this year's program. Leslie.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you so much, Secretary Albright, for bringing us your critical warning about the tyranny of fascism at this fateful moment when our democratic institutions here and abroad seem imperiled. Like you and me, many in our audience carry painful, familial memories of the evils wrought by fascists in other times and places, particularly, of course, in the Holocaust. As we struggle with re-emerging fears, we are grateful to you for so generously sharing your knowledge and experience. You have graciously offered to take questions directly from the audience today and to sign your books following the program. Now, to give your listeners time to formulate their thoughts, I'll take advantage of this terrific turnout that you have generated to remind everyone to take home a copy of our Amram schedule for the year and join us for upcoming speakers. Our next program on Sunday, November 4th, features another former ambassador with ties to the Czech Republic, Norman Eisen, who represented the United States in his mother's homeland under President Obama. His acclaimed new book, The Last Palace, Europe's Turbulent Century Through 5 Lives and 1 House, is a sweeping history told through an ornate mansion built by a Jewish businessman after World War I, later occupied by the Nazis, and ultimately the American ambassador's residence in Prague. A frequent CNN commentator on ethics and corruption in government, Mr. Eisen also served as special counsel for ethics in the White House. The 3 programs that follow in December, jointly hosted by the Amram Scholar Series and WHC Academy, offer a different format. On Monday evenings of December 3, 10, and 17, we'll have lectures followed by casual dinners and discussions of the given topic. Stuart Eisenstadt, himself a former U.S. ambassador and domestic policy advisor in the White House, will launch this mini-series with a discussion of his new book, President Carter, The White House Years. The 2 other speakers at these dinner programs will be foreign policy expert Stephen Cook, discussing the Middle East, and former Ambassador Wendy Sherman, lead negotiator on the Iran nuclear deal, whose new book outlines how to put the diplomatic values of courage, power, and persistence to work in our own lives. We'll kick off the new year on Sunday, January 6th, with New York Times journalist Jonathan Weissman and his book, Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump. You'll find 5 subsequent programs on our calendar, which you can find in the lobby after the talk. But speaking of the age of Trump presents the ideal point to return to Dr. Albright and the vital issues she is here to explore with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie. That was, it's a wonderful series, and we know everybody will join us, we hope. I'd like to begin with a couple of questions, and first I'd like to ask you, for your foreign policy and having done all that you've done, what are the forces that influenced you the most in your style of diplomacy as you engaged with all these leaders? Was it your education? Was it your life experience? Was it the policies of the administration that you represent?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and what a neat speaker series. They're all my friends, so I think I have to say it's a combination of those things. My father was a diplomat, and then when we came to the United States, all we ever talked about was foreign policy. I was the perfect daughter. I'm old, he's dead, I'm still the perfect daughter, but I grew up with the whole concept of being interested in foreign policy and diplomatic history. I also really did grow up with the importance of America's role in the world. And just for any Czechoslovak, Munich was the watershed event. And it happened in September 1938, and the British and French made a deal with the Germans and Italians over the heads of the Czechoslovaks and sold the country down the river. America was not there. As I mentioned, we spent the war in England, and I was a little girl when the Americans arrived. The Yankees came, and everything was different. And you could tell, and that was the first time I fell in love with Americans in uniform. And then, when the war ended, as a result of agreements made during the war, the Americans and the Soviet Union decided how they would operate, and even though General Patton was into a piece of eastern Czechoslovakia, it was the Red Army that was supposed to liberate the Eastern Bloc. And they did, and the Iron Curtain came down, and the country I was born in was under communism for 50 years. I could go on, but basically it made me think about the importance of American engagement. Then what happened was that I did have the honor of sitting behind a sign that said the United States, first at the United Nations, during a remarkable decade when, in fact, the UN was able to do an awful lot of things. Because life is so totally weird, the fact that as I said, my father had been ambassador in Yugoslavia, we were dealing with the Balkans, and I can understand Serbian, and so it's a combination of things, and I think that's true of everybody. It's a combination of our backgrounds.
Given your comments on this role and the role of the United States, I was struck recently by, just this past week, we had an article that was written in the New York Times. It was written by the ambassador at the time to Mexico from the United States, and she writes, sadly and shockingly, that she learned about the demise of NAFTA not from the State Department, but in fact from the reporters that were calling her in panic as she that morning was going to meet with the president of Mexico for the air show, which was going to be the largest opportunity to sell arms to Mexico. Tell me, what is the state of our State Department?
It's stateless. But let me say, I obviously was a great believer in the State Department, am a great believer in the State Department, and one of the things that was always a problem was the discrepancy between the amount of money that the Pentagon gets and the amount of money the State Department gets, and that's understandable in many ways. But the first budget that the Trump administration put forward was known as a skinny budget, and the discrepancy was just wild in terms of how much the Defense Department was going to get, somewhere over $700 billion, with the State Department kind of around $30 billion. Then what happened was Congress objected to that, and it upped the fund some. But what had happened was that a lot of people started leaving. And I do think that part of the issue was a lack of trust by the new government in terms of saying, these people have all worked for previous administrations, how do we know they're loyal Americans, and really questioning their loyalty, which is outrageous in so many ways. Also, I do teach at Georgetown, and I began to see that a lot of the students at the School of Foreign Service, which is set up in order for diplomacy and international business for their futures, were saying, why should we take the Foreign Service exam? So there was kind of a sense of even though people were leaving, but the pipeline was also being undercut. And so I think it's very hard for the State Department to exist, and I do think that Secretary Pompeo is trying to plus it up. He talks about returning swagger to the State Department, but it needs a lot more to get swagger. It needs people. If they talk about diplomacy, you need diplomats. And so I know Roberta Jacobson very well, she had a number of diplomatic posts and then had been Assistant Secretary for Latin America. And I read the article this morning, and you're supposed to get your instructions from the Assistant Secretary, and there are very few of those, and this should blow everybody's mind. We don't have ambassadors, given what's going on now, in Saudi Arabia and Turkey, for one, or in Pakistan, and a bunch of others. So I think it is very, very bad, and I don't understand why this keeps going on. I'm all for money for the Defense Department, but we need to have diplomats.
So given your final story in terms of that see something, say something, and do something, you warn us of fascism and the effect of the present rhetoric of divisiveness and the nature in terms of this particular type of nationalism, which seeks to drive us apart rather than create any sense of collaboration between the two sides of the aisle. What is the defense to that? What is it that you believe, as a nation can do, and that the citizens of this nation should engage in?
First of all, I think that we have to be aware that there are divisions in every society. And by the way, I was going to write this book no matter who'd gotten elected, because there really are divisions. And the best of leadership is when they can find common ground among those who might be on different sides of an issue. Instead, what happens about fascism is the leader exacerbates the divisions by turning the whatever tribal group he's identified with against the minority. And that is what has been going on, which is what's troubling. By the way, people think the book is alarming. It's supposed to be alarming. And what I decided to do was to do a historical approach to this. And Mussolini was the first fascist,
Right.
and partially what happened was that Italy felt disgruntled after World War I because it had not gotten what it thought it should get. There were prime ministers that kept changing jobs, and there was this young guy, Benito Mussolini, who was a very smart demagogue and was able to really rally people and use public action to do that. And this is the part about the book that, as I did research, blew my mind, is he got power constitutionally. King Emmanuel didn't like the weakness. Hitler got power constitutionally because with the problems of the Weimar Republic and the financial crisis, von Hindenburg asked him to come into office. Franco got power constitutionally because they also had a weak government. And then the other governments that I talk about now, the modern ones, were all elected, except for the Russians and the Chinese who had revolutions. So this happens democratically, and therefore my to-do list is first of all to make very clear that you can't have a president who's above the law, that the press is not the enemy of the people, that our institutional structure is very important in terms of who does what, and then that politics are important. People should either run for office or support those that do, because it is just essential for a democracy. Then my other two to-dos, one is to talk with people that you don't agree with. I hate to say this, but I don't like the word tolerance, because that's tolerate, put up with. I think we need to have respect for those that we disagree with and talk. And then finally, there isn't a book or a speech ever given that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So mine, I have a quote from Robert Frost that says, "The older I get, the younger are my teachers." And I am really very supportive of the young people, especially, I wrote this when the Parkland
Right.
students were out there marching and calling for town halls, and then students generally, and I hope that they understand that we need them. They are young, they are millennials, and people like me are perennials, so we have to, keep saying that.
Well, I know what is very refreshing about the book is in the beginning when you engage and talk about the definition that your students, that you asked them at Georgetown to give you a definition of fascism, and you're engaging those students in the process. And now I think we'll turn to our audience and see if there are individuals who would like to engage in the conversation. And I ask you to do something that is very un-Jewish. I want you to ask a question, not give a speech. This is Washington Hebrew. I've tied up, I have a total Alangopoly on the speeches that can be given with that. But please, if you have a particular question, you can come to one of the two mics that are there and ask a question if you wish. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you, while we're getting people to come down and line up for some of the questions, as you engage those students, what do you find? Because your book is alarming, but you're also hopeful in this book about the opportunities. And in this, what I find incredible is you do talk about, you do those three things, and that is that you do talk about you talk about the complaint, the concern, you fortify it historically and give us the insight, and then you actually talk about the opportunities that democracy gives us to challenge those things. What are you most hopeful in looking at democracy today?
Well, first of all, it's kind of paradoxical, is that democracy is resilient while it's also fragile, but it does need people to get very much involved. And I think that what we're seeing, I've been around campaigning and things, is that people are out there, they're beginning to ask questions, and I think that we can't be afraid to ask the questions. That's part of it, not to be put off, not to think that it's unpatriotic to question. And so I am hopeful about not just the American people, but generally that there's a lot going on where people kind of have said we've had it. By the way, the best quote in the whole book comes from Mussolini, who says, if you pluck a chicken one feather at the time, nobody will notice. So there's a lot of feather plucking going on. By the way, it's hard to say those two words together quickly. Right.
I would never even attempt that.
So we have to call it out. That's part.
That's so important. Yeah. Our first question.
Yes. Regardless of political party, which two people would you like to see throw their hat in the ring for the presidential election?
I'm not going to go there on that. No. But I do think that we have a huge opportunity. I have been involved in many, many presidential campaigns, and I think that there are going to be a lot of choices. I think the hard part is going to be trying to figure out where we are in both parties, frankly. And I do believe in a two-party system, very much so. Yeah.
Very good. Sir?
Hi there. I attended law school with one of your daughters, and it was before you really knew your Jewish heritage. Could you describe how your growing awareness of that heritage affected your work and your understanding of international relations?
For those who don't know, let me explain. I was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish, and so I have my own discussions with myself. What happened when I became ambassador to the United Nations and my name was in the paper, I began to get letters from people which had saying that they knew my parents, but mostly the letters were had the wrong facts. There was one letter I got from a man saying he'd gone to high school with my father in 1915, which would have been impossible since he was born in 1909. But the letters ended with, and then various letters say, I knew, et cetera, in this village, and they'd say, I knew your parents, your family, to be a Jewish family. But at the end of the letter, it would say, I now need a visa or some money. So then, when I was named Secretary of State, I was being vetted by the White House lawyers, and just before that, I had gotten a letter from somebody that had all the dates right and the villages right and everything right. And so as I was being vetted, they asked about taxes and nannies and all that. And then they said, we always ask this of everybody. Is there anything that we should have asked you that we didn't that you'd like to tell us? And I said, well, it's perfectly possible that I'm of Jewish background. And they said, so what? The president is not anti-Semitic. So over the holidays, I talked to my daughters. I don't know if you were in school with my youngest daughter. She's married to a Jewish man, and so they were thrilled. My parents were really very interesting people, and my children always loved to be with them, and they thought anything was possible given the various things that had gone on. So that is how I found out. And what happened is you can't talk to the press between the time that you're named and the time you're confirmed. And there was a reporter at the Washington Post that wanted to do a profile of me, and so we gave him the name of various people in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic, and so once I was confirmed, he came to the office and he started handing me these disgusting index cards. The Nazis were very bureaucratic, of all the people in my family that had been sent to concentration camps. It is one thing to find out you're Jewish, it's another to find out about the concentration camps. So that is the story. I've gone back, now traced it all, and 2 summers ago I went to the Czech Republic with my children and grandchildren and dedicated a plaque at Terezín to 26 members of my family
wonderful.
that had died. So what happened in terms of how it affected me, and I can say I knew about the Holocaust, I just didn't know it applied to my family. But so I can honestly say that it affected me without my knowing who I was. when dealing with the Balkans, because it really was ethnic cleansing of people, not for anything that they had done, but the religion that they were, and watching what was going on. And I'll never forget, there was a picture on TV of a man in a striped outfit, and it looked like somebody going to a concentration camp. And so I thought, you know, this is my opportunity to point out that this is not possible in this day and age. So I was affected by the whole concept of what happened during World War II. And then, of course, my Jewish background I didn't know at the time, and the more I knew it, the more I felt that we had to do something.
And your Jewish tradition supports that in the sense that the Bible tells us clearly that you should care for the stranger, but then reminds you that you were stranger to the land of Egypt. The commandment is to care for the stranger. The parenthetical is just that you might have empathy because you were.
Right.
And you have always done the right thing because of what has been known to you of caring for those. Please, your question.
Thank you for being with us this morning, Secretary Albright. My question relates to something going on currently at the State Department. We just had the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and now we have the the recall or return of the Consul General from Jerusalem back to the United States, meaning that the Palestinian issues will be handled in a different way. How do you think that this impacts the U.S. ability to act as an honest broker in this region and to make a difference?
By the way, as I look at this audience, I think to myself, if I were to invite you to Camp David, you might think you'd like to come. I can tell you after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't care if I ever go back. I think that one of the aspect is, what is the American role in all of this? And I think the honest broker part is a very important part. And I do think, I personally, having been through many weeks and months of negotiations, I think there is a reason why there are some final status issues, and Jerusalem and the refugees are among those. And so I happen to think that by preempting that, that creates an issue, and then doing not only that the Consul General has been pulled back, but I think it's a mistake to have closed insisted on the closing of the offices here of the Palestinians, because it puts us in a very hard position in terms of being an honest broker. And I do think we need to, I obviously am very supportive of Israel and have been forever, but I think that it's important for the U.S. to play that role, and we have made it harder in so many ways. I think the hard part is, and let me just say, the only person that you've probably had here but isn't coming in this speaker series is Dennis Ross. And Dennis knows more about everything, and he has a photographic memory. And, I'd say, when did that happen? And he'd say, well, that was when you were sitting with Netanyahu and he just gave you some tea or whatever. So, but I think that one of the things that Dennis was brilliant at was, in fact, bridging proposals, trying to figure out what had to be done. The problem is that we can stand on our heads and have brilliant bridging proposals, but unless the leadership of the Israelis and the Palestinians wants to do something, nothing is going to happen. And so I think it's important for us to keep the concept that we can play the honest broker, and it's the anniversary of many things, and it was of the Declaration of Principles when President Clinton had his arms out and Arafat and, Yitzhak Rabin shook hands. And by the way, every assassination is terrible, but Yitzhak Rabin's, I think, was more, it was dispositive in so many different ways, because I know from having spent time with Arafat that he actually trusted Rabin, and it made a difference. But I'm concerned about what our role can be.
And that's both Dennis Ross and David Makovsky in their book. They talk about creating that sense of trust and also creating that opportunity for America to be the even-handed even-handed voice that steps back. Yes, sir.
So, how is the suppression of the vote contributed to the fascist climate that we're getting here. And I'm thinking of Florida in the year 2000. I'm thinking of Wisconsin in 2016. And then there's also what's happened in the states of both North Carolina and Wisconsin. And then there's also the Democrats' somewhat contribution by somewhat abandoning the working class and describing treating the working class as a basket of deplorables.
Well, let me just say that I am, as I mentioned, I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. We go abroad and try to explain to people the nuts and bolts of democracy. And the fact that we are suppressing votes and the identification and various things that I read about take place is, there's no other word than outrageous about it. And I think we have to keep pointing it out in so many ways. And just every day you read about something where there are issues about that. I do think that we have had a problem in terms of, to some extent, losing contact with our base. We are a labor-based party, and I think that there were issues where we were not cognizant enough. I did do a lot of campaigning in 16, and just kind of watching the areas that, in Pennsylvania I was, for instance, where clearly it wasn't just the steel belt, but also a lot of rural people that felt that they were not being listened to. So I think we need to remember who we are. I am actually, this goes back to the first question, I am definitely a centrist. And so I hate to see divisions in our own party. And look what happens when there were divisions in the Republican Party with the Freedom Caucus taking over. And so, and there's an interesting article in one of the papers this morning, I think the FT this morning, about what's happened in Europe. The centrists are being displaced by far right and far left. And so I would hope that we could understand that finding common ground is more likely to come in the center.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Madam Secretary, in your book, you avoid the term totalitarianism. You never reference that, but you call both communist and fascist regimes, you use the term fascism. Could you explain that, please?
Well, first of all, let me say, fascism is not an ideology. It is really a process. And so I'm writing kind of about that in terms of how it is a way of seizing power, which is why I have put communists and far-right parties in the same boat. I think that, and it is hard to define, and one of the things is that it's clearly what we were talking about earlier, the identification of the leader with one group at the expense of another, majority rule and no minority rights. I think when we think of democracy, we have to understand minority rights. And there are autocrats. Every fascist is an autocrat, but not every autocrat is a fascist. The thing that makes a fascist is using violence, a bully with an army. And I have to say, I'm very concerned. We were talking about migrants when all of a sudden we're talking about mobilizing the military in order to keep people out on the U.S.-Mexican border. So the violence is part of the issue. So, but I don't think I deliberately didn't use totalitarianism, but it really is part of the whole thing of control over everything in some form.
Just given that, I'd like to ask you parenthetically a question in terms with the march that's going towards our borders of immigrants that are seeking refuge, and with the growing of the camps and the separation of children, in terms, what strategy would you give to Congress at this point to judiciously and fairly deal with our situation?
Judiciously and fairly. So let me say, I think what has to happen is a comprehensive immigration bill. I mean, as I said in my remarks, every country does have the right to control its borders. And the U.S. at various stages have been generous and not a fairly open and liberal immigration policy. But I do think that it's important for people to enter their country, this country or whatever country, legally, to have a process to go through. But it's hard if there is no judiciously arrived at immigration bill, and I think that's one of the issues. I think that what we're doing now with the separation of children is unbelievable, and not only that, but with our incredible technology that we don't know where people are, I think this cavalcade is an issue. I don't know quite how it's going to be resolved. I think it is very worrisome, and people are in rafts coming in and a number of different things. And I think we do need help from other countries in terms of setting up some kind of habitable camps for everybody. But I do think that we have to deal with this and not. Now, the thing that bothers me an awful lot is that I think the newest numbers in terms of how many people we are taking keep being cut more and more. Right. I do travel around a lot. We're a very big country, and we actually have room. And we do need workers in a number of different areas. So if there were some process, I think, or better process, or any process, that would really help. And the hard part is we cannot tell Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, or the Europeans what to do if we are the ones that are doing less than anybody. And so we have lost our authority in how to get others to kind of move forward with this.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, wait, sorry.
Secretary Albright, thank you for writing this book. I wanted to get your thoughts on your views of the role of religious institutions in Italy and Germany in the rise of fascism. Were they simply complicit or were they active? And then also your sense of what religious institutions in this country could be to play a more broader positive role in the whole political discussion.
I think that is one of the hardest things to analyze, because in the U.S. we believe in the separation of church and state. In a number of other countries that does not happen, and there kind of is a role for religious institutions. I think from my understanding of a lot of history, I do think that religious institutions were not particularly helpful during World War II. And again, reading the papers this morning and an op-ed by Anne Applebaum about what has happened in Poland. Poland was a very interesting case. This is where you wanted a religious institution. Pope John Paul, having been Cardinal Wojtyla, when he went back to Poland right after he was named Pope, the regime, the government didn't want to deal with him, and so they decided to turn it over to the parishes. And the parishes, as a result, this is not an English sentence, recognized how many of each other there were as people came out on the streets. And if there's one individual that helped to end communism, it was Pope John Paul. Now, we also, when we were in office, thought that he might be helpful in Cuba. But the role of the church in Cuba is different than the role of the church in Poland, and the Pope was Polish. But in reading the papers today, all of a sudden the Polish church is very far right and hyper-nationalist. And I was very disturbed by the piece, because depending upon the role of the church in X country, they can have a positive or a negative role. And it's hard to assess it. One of the things, I was talking to the rabbi, an earlier book that I had written was called Mighty and the Almighty. It was about the role of religion in foreign policy. And because we have separated church and state, most people don't think that are going into the diplomatic service or otherwise that they need to understand the religious history of a country in addition to its other cultural and languages. But it's hard, and it's hard to make kind of a generalized statement about it.
In my international work, I often remind my colleagues when we're doing this that the synagogue will rarely be to the right, but it's always right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really want to thank you for hosting this and this.
A little louder.
Oh, sorry. An event like this makes me proud to be a member of Washington Hebrew.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My question is, I'd like you to address the role of the failure of historical memory in addressing the consequences of the rise of fascism that enables people around the world to be receptive to demagogues because they don't view consequences as being possible that we know historically are possible.
Well, this is why I decided to take a historical approach to this, is to kind of look at what are the circumstances that are kind to, or provide an environment that makes them a host to those who have very far ideas. I think part of the problem is that people actually do want to have answers to complicated issues, and sometimes there are no answers. And you have somebody, by the way, Mussolini called himself a stable genius, and so I think that we do not, I think that there have to be ways where people think about what the answers might be and not just accept some kind of a simplistic answer, and need to understand the circumstances whereby that petri dish is kind of created, where a stable genius decides that he can take advantage of the divisions. And that's why I really thought the historical approach to this was important. One, in terms of describing the first fascist, Mussolini, and then Hitler, who took it to an even worse stage. Both of them, by the way, died ignominious deaths. And then also looking at the fact that the Hungarian, Orban, Poland, Turkey, Erdogan, in the Philippines, Duterte, Chavez in Venezuela, just the countries that I looked at, as I said, were all elected, and we have to look at how they were elected and why they were elected, and some of it did have to do with just simplistic answers. So the historical approach is very important.
Thank you.
Appreciate your comments today. You mentioned that there's such a major discrepancy between the funding in the U.S. for the State Department versus the Department of Defense. Is an outcome of that because the defense people are in so many more places that we probably do not have a diplomatic presence? Are there people in the Department of Defense actually doing diplomatic functions? And if so, I suspect that's at a fairly large scale. How is that impacting our diplomatic efforts around the world?
Well, first of all, the course that I teach at Georgetown, I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox. And we have, we're the most powerful country in the world, and there are not a lot of tools in the toolbox. I mean, there's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. There are the economic tools, trade and aid and sanctions. Then there's the use of force, the threat of the use of force and the actual usage of it. Intelligence and law enforcement, that's it. And I go through the tools, and I'm teaching tomorrow, and I'm doing sanctions. But I think that the thing that does happen, the use of force is not just a matter of how many boots on the ground we have, but really where they are, the bases that we have, and a number of the places that they are, and the assignments that they have. And it isn't all just shooting, it is having a relationship with the country. And so there are a bunch of things, especially as they're doing security. For instance, issues in Afghanistan, they have contact with the people in terms of how they can make peace with each other, so they do begin to kind of take on some roles that are more diplomatic. And the diplomats need the security of the military to be there. And the diplomats, we don't, we have a lot of people under arms, we don't have that many diplomats. So I understand the discrepancy on it in many, many different ways. I do think, and this is what I find most interesting, and by the way, I'm doing use of force next week, so I was going through all my notes on this, and reading the national security strategy and the defense strategy. And Secretary Mattis has talked about the fact about having more lethal force, one that operates in different areas, but he also said if we don't have a State Department, he has to buy more ammunition. And so he really does understand the role of diplomacy. It's just that huge discrepancy between the two, because the State Department budget not only has to pay the diplomats and run our embassies in a secure way, but make the contributions to the United Nations and NATO and various other aspects to international organizations. So that's the problem. And I do think there is cooperation between the military and the diplomats, but the military is taking up more of the kinds of issues that one would think are diplomacy. Yeah.
So
Please.
First, thank you very much for writing this wonderful book. On page 39, you say, Hitler's claim to distinction rested not on the quality of his ideas, but on his extraordinary drive to turn warped concepts into reality. Where others hesitated or were constrained by moral scruples, he preferred to act and saw emotional hardness as essential. From early in his career, he was a genius at reading a crowd and modulating his message accordingly. In conversations with advisors, he said most people earnestly desired to have faith in something and were not intellectually equipped to quibble over what that object of belief might be. Considering that we have many politicians in this country, and one in particular, who, although not Hitler, are using some of the same techniques, do you think the best way for Democrats to deal with people who use those techniques is to go high or to fight fire with fire?
I think both, actually. Let me just say, I do think that part of the thing that one has to remember is that Mussolini, Hitler, everybody was able to use the media in some particular way. In terms of major, certainly Hitler had that perfected with Goebbels and public way of dealing with things. I think, and then getting rid of media that they disagreed with. We cannot do that. And that, I think, is why I think we need to speak out much more about what's happening to the media and how one actually gets to the truth. I think that we need to be able to not necessarily go low, but in fact try to state our case we need a message. I really do think we need a message, and I think we all need to work on that. But I also think that we need to have a better concept about the people that we're talking to. As I said before, not talk down to people, but engage in conversations with them, and then be smarter about our use of public media in a number of different ways. But the best thing is going around and talking to groups of people, as I mentioned. I do think my description fits somebody else. And while I would never compare anybody to Hitler, I do think that we need to be aware, especially as we look at what's been happening in the last few weeks. President Trump is actually really good at motivating a crowd. And it is something that is very troubling in so many ways, but I think watching it is something that I don't want any candidate that we have to resemble that, but I think people need to understand what's going on.
Thank you.
I want to follow that up because it was Lord Jonathan Sacks, who in one of his books brings up the problem that we have today is that we no longer broadcast news, but we narrowcast news. And so how do we achieve the sense of, in everything that you've written about, you've talked about a sense of diversity. You often appear at times on panels and things with people who are you're polar opposites, and you're not afraid of dialogue, you're not afraid of engagement, and you understand that that's where the true understanding of ideas may come from. How do we fight that in this age of narrowcasting and us, with our little handheld devices only seeing and reading what we wish to read?
Well, I think it is really hard, frankly, because, I hate to say this, it is hard to figure out what truth really is.
Yeah.
Makes me sound like a relativist. And the only way I can suggest is that one read a lot of different things and do what you're supposed to do in research, is get different sources. But what has happened is everybody is in their echo chamber and does not really kind of channel tune or whatever, trying to figure out. It is very hard. I also do think is that there is a sense, which is why I said that I do listen to right-wing radio and Fox and try to figure out what they're saying. I have to say, though, what is happening is more and more, when you talk about panels, what's happened even now with the CNN and MSNBC are people just yelling at each other and not really having kind of discussions where they can follow something for a little while. And I do think ratings make a huge difference. I think I hate to be critical of the press because it really just goes into what Trump is saying. It is not fake news. They are trying very, very hard. And I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. And I really do try to get a view of different things, even reading the same story. But I'm not going to say it's easy. It is definitely not easy. And by the way, I think that I was very interested in studying what happened during the Arab Spring.
Right.
What happened, frankly, was the people that went to Tahrir Square initially had been brought there by social media, echo chamber. And one of the things that happened, and God forbid I would be the one to say this, the elections happened too soon. The Muslim Brotherhood was organized, and the people that arrived in Tahrir Square there were no political parties, they didn't know what they were doing, and they only were listening to what they already agreed with. So this all takes a while.
Well, and this is why I think that I believe it's critical what happens on the university, and I'm so concerned when universities become partisan, when we shut down and we won't let other voices come in. And I commend Georgetown in terms of the fact that they've often had such diversity of voices represented, because that's, I think, to train a next generation to hear and assess is critical, and both are for everything. So I think we're over to this side.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening to the talk. And I have one question. Following from that historic question before, lots of these fascist governments, when they've been installed in Europe in the 20s and 30s, and now these autocratic governments, I can't think of a single sort of historic situation where the societies itself fought the government from within the fascist government. You always needed these external forces to pressure them out again. And that's what I wanted to know. If you have what's your view on actually that the disposal of fascist governments, they either have to die, there has to be, or an external sort of threat coming in?
I think that it is possible for them to come from the inside. I think that well, first of all, changing any government is not simple when you go from one party to another. But I do think that there are ways that governments that there can be change from the inside. I mean, what I find interesting is more, for instance, I followed Turkey an awful lot. And there was a time that it was run by the military and by elitist groups. And this is the hard part, Erdogan was actually elected fair and square by doing constituency services and not just dealing with either the military or the people that lived on the other side of the Bosporus that had the big houses. So I do think that there are ways that this can happen. The question is how you solidify it. I'm better at understanding how you get rid of communist governments, which is what happened after the fall of the wall. And Orban was a major dissenter. We all loved him. By the way, he was funded by George Soros to go study at Oxford. So what is it that happens then in terms of the changeover? Why did he go bad, so to speak? But there also are ways that outside forces, I think, can make a difference. One of the issues is that, and there's some discussion, we're about to have the 70th anniversary of NATO. NATO is not just a military alliance, but also a political alliance, which is supposed to be an alliance of democracies. So there is that. And then when I was in office, I created something called the Community of Democracies so that there could be a sharing of best practices to help each other in that. So it can be done from the outside, with help from the outside to some group inside.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is a really interesting discussion, and I have a lot of questions, but I thought, since nobody's mentioned Saudi Arabia, that I should bring it up so I could get your feelings on the situation. And I mean, basically because I'm trying to get an understanding of what they were thinking when they had, I mean, they know they need the U.S. because because of, you know, their fear of Iran right now. And so we have this whole coalition between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Israel that was, I guess, giving people a hope for even maybe peace in the Middle East. And then things are going fine, and then they kill this guy in an embassy who happens to be writing articles for the Washington Post. I'm just trying to get an idea of what could they be thinking. I know you must know, if not bin Salman, then his father. And how do you think this administration should approach the situation?
Well,
Thank you.
It's very hard to figure out why they think they did, you know, what they thought they were going to get out of this. But I have to say, we have had, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have been partners in a number of things ever since Franklin Roosevelt, and trying to figure out how to have a relationship with that country. I think there have been times when we have spoken out more about what some of the issues are, but there's no question this is not new in terms of the, I think that I did do the study of the Middle East with Steve Hadley. We were kind of looking at an overall aspect of it. And I think, by the way, I worked for a president who read a lot, and he assigned us books. So a book that President Clinton assigned to me, which I'm sure many of you know, is called The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, which talks about the creation of the modern Middle East and after the First World War. And a short version of the book is that the modern Middle East was created by the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other. So they set up some artificial countries. There were a number of different issues, and I think one needs to know some of the history. Most Americans also don't know anything about Islam, much less the difference between the Shia and the Sunni, and then the historical animosity between the Persians, i.e. the Iranians, and the Arabs. So a lot of that is going on. And the royal family in Saudi Arabia is very large and is trying to sort out what it's doing. I think they are afraid of a free press. There's no question. And Khashoggi was definitely somebody that was writing articles about it. I have found very hard to understand how the Crown Prince MBS was actually doing some good things in terms of getting the religious police out of things and helping women. But I think deep down, he clearly was doing things that we would have disagreed with and should have made more of a point about Yemen, why they're using American arms to kill people there, theoretically, because they're fighting with the Houthis who are pro-Iranian, why they took all these people and locked them up in the Ritz-Carlton, all those things that they did, and we haven't objected. And I think that we have to speak out against this. And the investigation has to proceed. But I think Congress is beginning to look at what's going on. I heard Chairman Corker this morning talking about things. The Global Magnitsky Act is something that is sanctions on people that are doing things to by undermining human rights. And so I think there is a congressional way to deal with this, and I think that we need to speak up about it. We have made it in the past a lesson of America that you can deal with a country, but you have to speak out about what's going wrong, and we have not done that.
Is this fear of, in this sense, and a worldview, when we're silent on some of these injustices, is it, does the world see us as powerless or just complicit?
I think they both, frankly. I really do think, because what has happened is, I think depending upon the administration, there has been a speaking out about these things. Sometimes you do them very much in public, and sometimes you do them in private. But then I was very surprised that Secretary Pompeo was kind of all smiles and yucking it up when he was there. and one doesn't know what he said in private. But the part that really, I think, is appalling is that we have been friends with Saudi Arabia. We have sold them arms, but we have never done it in such a transactional way as President Trump talks about. After all, they're going to buy stuff from us, to never really speak out about what is going on. And so I think that there are many tragedies, which go back to your initial question, is that in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there has been a time where there was an Arab suggestion that came out of Saudi Arabia in terms of trying to find a two-state solution. There was the hope that when this new kind of grouping took place, that the Saudis were going to be able to play a more positive role in terms of bringing the Israeli-Palestinian issue to a good solution. That is now out of the box. So we don't know all the effects of this, but I do think that it's important for the U.S. government to speak out about this. And you can only so long say the investigation has to go on, trying to figure out what has happened and say they are buying X number of billions of arms. There has to be a way that we remember who we are.
Very good. Yes, please.
Hi, I just want to thank you for being here, first of all. I'm wondering what kind of advice you offer to your students at Georgetown or to young people in general wanting to go into diplomacy or international relations in this kind of age where, we're talking about fascism and tyranny and kind of the demise of democracy. What advice do you have?
Well, I've always thought it was something that people should do, but women, young men, to go into diplomacy, but it's never been more important, I think. I also think that what needs to happen is a broadening of what young diplomats know these days. So I went to college, Wellesley, sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. So, so when
that was that first Apple thing.
The thing that happened was I was a poli-sci major, and I took history. I took one econ course. You would think that that had been something really out of the way. And I think now that the curriculum has to be broadened to have science, health policy, understanding technology, a number of different aspects, and I think it's more important than ever. I believe that, by the way, the world is a mess, and that's a diplomatic term of art, and basically there has to be more partnerships between the private sector and the public sector, which means that there has to be understanding on both sides of that. And so there is, I believe that international relations is a growth industry, and people need to go into it, but with a broader focus on it. And then I know some of the students that I have don't want to be associated with this policy, and I said, believe it or not, you're first going to stamp visas, so don't worry about that. You're not going to be associated with the policy, but if you're not in the government, not part of this, I think, as I said earlier, the pipeline will be broken, and we are going to suffer for that later.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. It feels like the inability of Congress to do its role in the country and the dysfunction of Congress, and it's been decades now. We're turning into an imperial presidency where policy is done through executive order, and the whole structure of the American democracy is off kilter. And is that trend going to continue, or is there a way to bring it back to this 3 equal parts of government?
Well, I think what is really incredible about our government is the structure of the 3 institutional structure and the way they're supposed to work together. By the way, I worked on the Hill. I worked for Ed Muskie at a certain stage, and I think the executive-legislative relationship is fascinating. And I have to admit that what happens is where you sit is where you stand. I mean, you really do see, I went down and worked for President Carter, and then you see differences. But I have been up on the Hill an awful lot now, saying to people, the first article of the U.S. Constitution is about the power of Congress, written in that way, and it is an invitation to struggle between the executive and legislative branch, but this is Article 1 time, and I have gone there to talk to a lot of the people about what has to be done, and in my toolbox, every one of the tools needs to be activated by Congress. Whether it's, giving advice and consent on the diplomats, or multilaterally instructions in terms of what happens in the international organizations, trade, the Commerce Clause. Congress has a right to do that, any number of things. And there, with any luck, there will be a lot of new people coming in. And I think they need to understand the role of Congress, because executive actions can only go so far and should only go so far, and you can only override, the president can veto things, but you need the vote to override it. So I literally have been up there a lot telling people that, and I think that rather than gridlock, we need to figure out how to do this. But it is a problem, and I think we are going to have a little problem with the judicial branch also. So I think it's important to try, but it is a lesson, and it goes to something else, which ultimately I think we all say when we talk to each other. Something has to be done about our educational system. People need to take civics. They need to understand, they actually need to read the Constitution and understand the responsibility of the people to tell their elected leaders that they want to see some action and not gridlock.
Thank you.
Please.
Madam Secretary, as fascism starts to rear its ugly head again, and we may repeat history with the help of the internet, that highway of hate. How can we join this see something, say something, expose something movement and really be activists? There are so many people who are sleeping and don't know what's happening. They don't care. The international press really doesn't do very much, so that we don't know what's happening abroad as much as we could know, and likewise here. So what do we do as activists, or how do we help others become activists?
Well, we the people. I mean, I think that we have to get out there and talk about it. And I actually, you were saying at universities that people, I think it is fine to protest. I really do. It's the violence that one can't put up with. But I do think we need to make our voices heard and not think, we can't normalize what's going on. This is the feather plucking. I mean, I think we have to speak out and make it very clear that this is not what we expect. But it does take either running for office or supporting the people that you want to have there. And then once they get into office is to try to maintain contact with them, that they really continue to do what they do. I think our problem at the moment is we think this will change without us. It will not. And one of the problems that's way down there is, the social contract has been broken. People decided to give up some individual rights in order to be protected by a government, and neither side is fulfilling its obligations. Voting is a privilege, but it's also a duty. So we were talking about some of the problems about the difficulties of voting, but then there are people who aren't voting. And some of the young people, they think it won't go away. Voting is our way to make it happen. And I think that if my call out is, whoever you're going to vote for, this is going to happen in 18 days. We have to really, this is the way we make our voices heard. People in other countries stand in lines in the heat and the rain in order to vote, and we can't get our act together to go and vote. So that's what we have to do at the moment.
So you know that no book will be signed. No book will be signed today unless you're registered and intend to go vote. Phyllis.
I have a two-parter. first part a little serious, the other less so. The CIA, is that part of state or defense? Do they answer to anyone, and if so, whom?
Okay. Well, the CIA is an independent agency, but what has happened that is interesting is as a result of 9/11, Congress put together the Director of National Intelligence and the CIA is independent, but the State Department has an intelligence section, the Defense Department has an intelligence section, and so everybody answers to the DNI, who answers to the President. So, the President can call in anybody from those agencies. And what happened was in 1947 with the National Security Act, that's when the CIA was created, and when the Defense Department was created, and the National Security Council in its current setting.
Thank you. The other thing, what do you think of the TV show, Madam Secretary?
So this is
Phyllis, you asked my question.
So this is what happened. By the way, I do watch TV, and I have to kind of explain why I watch something. So I don't know whether you remember, there was a show called Army Wives, and I decided to watch that because it had messages about how hard it was for the spouses to all those issues, so that you could see that if issues are raised in some kind of a entertainment way, people understand it. So what did happen several years ago, Taya Leone called me up, and she said, can we get together? I want to know what the Secretary of State does. So we're having breakfast, and I'm having this serious conversation with her, and I'm explaining the job, and then I thought, really? Am I doing this? So then the writers got interested in what we were talking about. So I thought, well, this is actually a good idea, that it really raises the various international issues in a way that people will identify with them and understand the job. So I did do one show just by myself with her, and then we just did this show with the 3 secretaries. And former secretaries, I managed to get an unscripted line in. I don't know how many of you watched it, but when we sat down, I said, isn't it nice when the current Secretary of State consults with her predecessors? We used to do that all the time. So I think it's a great show.
Last question here.
Madam Secretary, first I want to thank you for writing the book and promoting this discussion in a public way. I think it's very important. I have a 2-part question. First part is, do you regret that your parents never shared your heritage with you? And had they done so, how do you think this would have affected your outlook on fascism?
Well, first of all, I do regret, but I understand what happened, because I think that, as I now understand, we spent the war in England, we went back to Czechoslovakia after the war. I didn't really, even though I have pictures with my grandparents, I was 2 years old, I don't remember them at all. And I thought, I didn't ask about what happened to my grandparents or anything like that. We then had to leave again to come to the United States. We lived in Denver, Colorado. And I think my parents, knowing so much about what they were like in terms of being protective of all of us, thought, we have a new life. Why should we burden the children with this incredible sadness? And so I wish I had known earlier, but the bottom line is, there's some people who say, was I mad at my parents about it? No, I just feel desperately sorry for my parents that they, in fact, lived with this and didn't burden us with it. I wish that they had been alive when I found out so that I could ask more, but I understand, and I found it very troubling when people were very critical of them when all this came out. By the way, I was getting an honorary degree at Princeton not long ago, and I'm at the dinner the night before. I'm sitting next to the president of Princeton, and he says, I didn't believe a word you said about not knowing and why you didn't know. And I thought, damn it, I didn't come here to I came to get an honorary degree. And he said, I didn't believe it until I found out I had the same story. And so there are a lot of people, for one reason or another, and I find it very hard to be judgmental about why and how people make their decisions. So I do regret. It doesn't affect any way that the way I think about how to solve problems. It just makes me feel desperately sorry for my parents, that they really, that they went through this and did whatever they did. Initially, I am self-centered enough to think that when they left Czechoslovakia in 1939, some of it had to do with protecting me. If they hadn't left, I went back to Prague not long ago, and the names of my grandparents are on the Pinkas Synagogue. If they hadn't left, my name and their name would be on the walls of the Pinkas Synagogue. So I am very grateful to them and feel sorry for them.
Well, we are incredibly grateful for the circumstances of however the history played out, in terms of, we live in an age, in a time, this past week with the statements by Louis Farrakhan and other statements are going. We live in an age with the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of Islamophobia, this divisiveness and this nature. And I believe what is so important about your book is asking us to speak out, asking us to be aware. In this age and in your warning, I'd like to end and ask, as a Jewish community, given our understanding, and I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor, and every time I pick up the phone to my 89-year-old mother, who the first 5 minutes are telling me exactly what's going on today is what happened in her lifetime, and seeing that. And it's shocking and it's difficult. And I do not want to be written about in history the way some of the European rabbis were written about, of being complicit by being silent. So as knowing your history and knowing this, what should we do as the bearers of that history and the honor of living in this free country to make sure that fascism doesn't rear its ugly head?
Well, I think we all have to speak out. I think that, we can't be silent, and it isn't just about whatever religion one is, but everything that is kind of part of the aspect of fascism is it always needs a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is somebody that is different from you, And so I think it's important for us to recognize this. And so I think that whatever community one comes from, we have to speak out about it and really not think, oh, as I said earlier, this is normal, it'll go away. Given the complications of technology and some of the issues that we talked about, gridlock, et cetera, it's even more important that private citizens speak out. So we started this out in talking about immigration, and if I could just, one of the things that I love to do is to go and hand out the naturalization certificates at the ceremonies. So the first time I did it was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello.
Wow.
Since I had Thomas Jefferson's job, I thought that I could do that. So I'm handing out the naturalization certificate, and all of a sudden I hear this man saying, "Can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State." So I went to find him, and I said, "Can you believe that the Secretary of State is a refugee?" And that is what this country is about.
Thank you. Stay 1 second. So the applause and the standing ovation is so well deserved. Not, Madam Secretary, for today, but for who you are every day and what you stand for. We thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Washington Hebrew Congregation, you are known for wearing brooches. And you're also known for broaching subjects that are difficult, that are critical, and that are going to change our world. So we have for you a brooch made by a Yemenite jeweler in Israel who is a refugee himself, and we hope you will wear it with pride, and we hope that you will continue to push your forward with your brooch on your side and broach many more issues and bring us the world that you envision. Thank you so much. Isn't that beautiful? So, Madam Secretary will join us briefly in the lobby to sign books.